Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Talking Behaviour. Well, I am Charlie, and with me is
James, hello.
and we are going to be talking to you about prompting today, and we are potentially going to be moving on to prompt fading and prompt hierarchies in later episodes, which should be very interesting things to go over. How are you, James?
Yes, I'm all good, thank you. How about yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing really good. It's been a very busy period of time, generally. So, first thing I've kind of got to ask you is, what is a prompt? Do you have any idea about this?
About what a prompt is?
Yeah.
Only the basics of...
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so a prompt is something that will happen or occur to I'm trying to not use the word prompt here, to cause a action to occur off the back of it.
Yeah, that's pretty good, actually. It's very close to the actual definition, which is anything that a person does to increase the chance that another person engages in a behavior, right? And prompts are very important in the process of skills teaching, because if you can prompt somebody to do a behavior, then you are potentially able to do the first stages of teaching them how to do it unprompted, right? A lot of behavioral intervention is focused on what is called increasing independence, and prompting is part of the process that behavior analysis and behavioral intervention has chosen as one of the more effective methods for skills teaching. There have been many things which have been defined about prompts, which we're kind of going to go through today, and then they've basically developed procedures which allow you to use prompts and fade prompts along what's called a prompt hierarchy to increase the chance of somebody first doing a behavior and then doing it independently. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
So the first thing I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit is that prompts have many dimensions to them. There are many different types of prompts, and they basically involve how it is perceived by the individual and how obvious it is. Okay? We call this salience. We've talked about that a little bit before, right? So the general idea behind it is if you can perceive something and you are aware that that something should cause you to do a behavior, that thing can be used as a prompt, right? Mm-hmm. So this may be that if you see a picture of your mother and then when you see it, you produce her name, this can then be tied to the question of what's your mum's name, and then showing the picture to prompt the behavior, and then potentially providing a reinforcer or reinforcement to try and increase the chance that it occurs in the presence of the question, what is your mother's name, right? This would be a single trial of teaching, and this would potentially be how you would teach somebody to be able to answer questions relating to personal information, right? So that prompt type that I'm talking about there with the picture is called a tact prompt, right? Okay. And it's a tact because it contacts your senses, and we call a tact a label, right? Okay. Or we would call it as a lay people, right? But behaviorally, it's a tact. This is one of the verbal operants defined by Skinner in his treatise Verbal Behavior. Okay, so a tact prompt is quite good because it is not particularly obvious in certain ways what is expected when a picture of your mother is shown to you, right? It's not as if you are basically being given the full form of the word of your mother's name. Instead, you're basically being given something which is related to it, and then you will produce the word yourself, right? This is useful because it means that you have only given part of the answer to the person, right? This is effectivity, or rather, this is intrusivity, sorry. Intrusivity is the process of how much of the skill you are having to do for the person, right? Intrusivity is very, very important because it can be kind of defined by like salience, right? How obvious it is, how much of the thing is being done. And that means that you can, if you can identify what the whole prompt is, you can also define what part of the prompt is. You can define what a minimal prompt in that situation would be as well. These are three of the prompt levels that I generally use in my work because I feel like they are quite general terms which allow you to explain what the concept of prompt fading is, or a prompt hierarchy, without actually having to define it as a physical partial prompt, right? It's a full prompt if you are having to give the whole prompt for the whole behavior. It's a partial prompt if you're having to do part of the behavior for the person. It's a minimal prompt if you are having to initiate them doing the behavior, or that might be like a tap on the arm if someone was doing something physical.
And then they do the rest themselves.
Correct. Yeah. They do the full form of the behavior. You just indicate that they are expected to do it effectively.
Yeah.
Right. So this basically shows you a little bit what the concept is, right? We're effectively trying to find what is the most effective version of the prompt that produces the behavior that we want to see, right? And the less intrusive that effective prompt is, the better.
Yeah.
Right? So this basically means that we can generally set up systems as behavioral people where we start from the least intrusive prompt possible that is still effective at producing the behavior. And the more that you learn about how to do this form of intervention, the quicker that you can get to that, identify it, and then begin the process of prompt fading. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So do you have any questions so far about anything that I've said?
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay, so let's move on a little bit and talk about uses then, because I think that that is an area which potentially has quite a lot of ground to cover. Generally, I would define there to be two primary situations where you would use a prompt, and it is when you are either trying to correct an error, right, or you are trying to teach errorlessly. Right? So error correction involves you trying to get somebody to produce a skill and then producing the incorrect skill or not producing the skill that you are expecting them to, right? So as an example, with that what's your mother's name situation again, if I was correcting an error because I was expecting you to get it right, I would say, what's your mum's name? You would say something else or you would not say anything. And then I might restate my question, hold up the picture of your mum, right? You produce the correct name, right? And then I reinforce potentially differentially, i.e., with less reinforcement than you would have gotten if you did it independently. And then try and arrange for a trial later in the day where you could try and get it back independently, right? Several things will affect whether that second trial is likely to be producing the correct behavior as well, including how long after you use the effective prompt, how intrusive the prompt was, and whether you use the procedure to try and fade it systematically, right? Errorless teaching is the process that behavior analysts have kind of developed to, when we know someone is going to make a mistake, if we allow them to, instead provide the prompt before the mistake is made, right?
Interesting.
So I know that last time I asked you this question, you gave the incorrect response, but I know that you're going to respond to that tagged prompt, right? The picture of your mum being shown. So what do? From the first instance, say, what's your mum's name, and hold up the picture of your mum so you know what answer to give. You say the correct one, and I provide a high value reinforcement, right? You're trying to increase the behavior. They haven't errored, and it's more that they are expected to require the prompt at this point. So you don't put a lower value on it.
Yeah.
Right?
Would you pair those two sort of in consecutive days, sort of thing?
Could you clarify that?
For example, you've done it with just the audio prompt of what's your mum's name, and they haven't, so they've made an error.
Just to make a clarification, it's not an audio prompt to ask them the question. It is, in fact, the expected discriminative stimulus for producing the behavior I'm looking for. I'm actually trying to teach you to respond to the question, so it is not a prompt. It's just the actual circumstances I'm expecting you to answer, just to clarify that.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Does that clarify anything?
Yes, I think it does. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. If that was going to be the point. So the general answer of what you're looking for is this is an ABC model of teaching. If you think about it, the antecedent is you being presented with a question. The behavior is you answering the question either correctly or incorrectly, and the consequence is either reinforcement or prompting, prompt fading, and then differential reinforcement in the form of error correction, right? For errorless teaching, there is really only one line that is expected, or there could be a second line if you have selected the incorrect prompt, because it's either question plus prompt, answer, reinforcement, and then some kind of fading system, or it's question plus prompt, incorrect answer, which means you've selected the wrong prompt. It was ineffective at producing the behavior, and then you have to adjust in that consequence by representing the discriminative stimulus, which is the question, just to remind you, putting a more effective prompt or a more intrusive prompt that is likely to produce the behavior, and then doing the consequence you were expecting to, right? You would want to keep track of that, because really you wouldn't want to go to the ineffective prompt until you are sure that they are consistently responding
To the
under
effective
the
one.
effective.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get it completely. Exactly. So these situations are both very, very good because they allow us to effectively, firstly, correct any unexpected errors that occur during the intervention, but also they allow us to teach errorlessly, right? We don't let the person make the incorrect response. We know that that response will happen if we aren't to prompt beforehand. Instead, we prompt the correct behavior on the first instance and then systematically fade our prompt out using a prompt fading system, of which there are several, right? And then we use that process plus differential reinforcement to increase the likelihood they answer to the question on its own. Okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So, any questions so far on that?
No, that makes sense.
Okay. Next one we'll talk a little bit is about some issues which you can see with prompting, including some things which are just things that will happen using these sorts of systems if you don't account for them, and some things which are actual problems which people need to actually adjust. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm going to talk about to start is prompt dependency, right? Which can happen with someone who has, let's say, autism and a learning disability, and they do not generalize their skills appropriately or as easily as someone who doesn't have those conditions.
Okay.
Right? This basically may mean that the person basically will wait for you to prompt because they are expecting it if they don't definitely know the answer. And so you don't get as much natural responding out of them. They just kind of freeze until the prompt is presented, and it might be much harder to fade that prompt out with that kind of person. Okay. Prompt dependency shows up a lot in the intervention type that we talk about a lot, and it's a real challenge. It's one of the things that is a bit of a criticism of this methodology of intervention is obviously it's taking away the kind of processing in this, right? It's not asking you to kind of problem solve your way out of it. It's providing a completely effective way of you producing the behavior, and it might slow down your learning in other ways.
Yeah.
Which is why we use it with people who are already in a situation where they need that extra help.
Yeah.
And also they might find it very distressing if they are being asked to do something and presented that that is incorrect, right?
Yeah.
Second thing we're going to talk about is ineffective prompting, which can effectively interfere with it can interfere with intervention in a lot of ways, right? If you are using ineffective prompts and the person is not providing the responses that they are expected to, it is effectively not helping them to be continuously trying to provide prompts, especially if they find that to be particularly like just emotionally intrusive, not just intrusive in the case of the actual dimension of the prompt, right? We select our prompts very carefully when we're working with different people based upon their profile. If somebody doesn't like physical contact, using a physical prompt was probably not the best idea.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if someone is highly motivated for physical prompts, it might also not be the best thing to select physical prompting because they may resist the prompts to get the physical input that they are seeking, right? Yeah. So the person's profile is massively important in this situation. We need to be looking at the person and going, what things are they willing to respond to, and what things are effective,
likely to be effective,
at actually producing them.
That's such a thin line to sort of tread as well, and you almost feel like you have to, obviously that's what the point of the profile is, but you have to know that person and what they are going to respond to. And I guess at times there probably will be inevitably mistakes made.
Yep.
And you will use ineffective prompts because you've either misread how something was going to happen or just misjudged how effective it was going to be.
Yeah, and no matter how good you are at something, when you first start working with a new person, especially if they've never been involved in this kind of intervention before, how do you find what is effective and acceptable? You test, which means you're going to make a lot of no answers before you identify the correct one, unless you've done a lot of good observation beforehand, have identified things which are likely to work, have maybe observed them with the people that they are, their parents, their guardians, their network, and seen how they interact with those people. So having all of that information at the beginning, really, really helpful. Sometimes you are not given the opportunity to get that stuff, and then you have to do a process of effectively trial and error to be able to actually identify what works and what doesn't for a person. Right. So this is actually a really good way of looking at it. Is the longer that you get to observe somebody before you go in to intervene in these situations, and the more input you get from the people who know them before then, probably the easier this process is going to go for the person, for you,
identifying it,
and for everyone. But I do accept that that is not always going to be possible, and that unfortunately sometimes you are just put into a room with someone and expect it to work it out. So that's interesting enough. So Overly intrusive prompting is another thing which I would say is a concern in these situations,
Okay.
right? We want to be very, very careful when we are first doing this testing process that we are not overdoing it and accidentally triggering a load of stuff, or conditioning ourselves using classical conditioning, which we've talked about before, to be seen as a negative or aversive person by being overly intrusive
Yeah.
and actually really bothering the person. I.e., you do really want to observe as much as possible the kinds of things that they're willing to accept. You do want to try and adjust what you're doing so that if they didn't want to be following that prompt in the method that you presented it, that you adjust and alter the way that you are interacting with that individual, that you be strategic, right, in this situation. Okay? Let's have a little think. Next thing we'll talk about is, I guess, data, right? Which is, if you do not take very, very good, very accurate data in these situations, it is entirely possible that you will not be able to follow a prompt fading system effectively. You might think things are going well because the person is producing the behavior that you're looking to teach, but actually, if you weren't taking data on it, and you don't know it's a variable skill, like it's occurring sometimes, it's not occurring on others, you might have a couple of problems that you need to actually deal with. You might need to look at the motivation of the person and whether they're doing it just because it's easier to follow the prompt rather than have you continuously escalate the level of intrusivity that you're doing.
Right, okay.
Or are they actually motivated to complete the skill, right? Do they know the context in which they're expected to be producing the skill, right? So all of these things are much easier to tell if you look at the data, right? If I'm going into a school or a college or an institution that takes this data, I can go and look at the data sheet and tell whether somebody is teaching correctly or incorrectly just by looking at how the prompts were recorded, right? If it's going full prompt independent or full prompt full prompt, full prompt, full prompt, full prompt with no fading whatsoever, I can already identify that there's something which I need to go in and change with that program, right? But if I can see that across a day they managed to fade it from a full prompt to a partial prompt, right? And then the next day they picked up on the partial prompt and started on that and got it consistently under the control, and then faded it to a minimal prompt by the end of that day, that person is probably doing quite a good job at prompt fading, right? So data is really important from the kind of case management point of view because you're not there all the time, and it is a very good indicator of whether the person who is doing one-to-one intervention, right, the behavior skills technician in my organization, or ABA tutor inside of an ABA VB school, right, whether they are effectively following the procedures which are evidence-based, more likely to actually teach the person to produce a skill independently. And it can also mean that if you see all of those things are true, they're trying and they're doing it in the correct manner, and it's still not working, you probably have to go and observe directly and then institute some form of program change. Okay?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Lovely. Do you have any questions about any of this?
I don't. I guess that potentially would depend on what sort of the end goal is. But I was going to say, I guess it would massively vary from person to person as to what you would count as success in regards to how quickly you are able to fade those prompts.
Consistency, right? I would be looking to see whether somebody was actually trying to fade it too quickly a lot of the time. So if somebody goes straight from a full physical prompt and then is trying to get from that to independent, right, as in they're doing it in the correct context in response to the instruction or the question or the context, I might be able to then go, actually, they should be being more systematic about their fading of the prompt. Instead, go from full physical to partial physical to minimal, minimal to independent. And that might be slowing the teaching process down. People think giving the opportunity at the earliest opportunity is a good thing because it gives a person a chance to kind of jump the steps. But if someone doesn't have the cognitive ability, if somebody doesn't have the capacity to jump from a really, really intrusive prompt to a completely unintrusive prompt, it's actually going to take weeks or months for that person to learn the skill that way, when you could probably get it done in a week if you were really systematic about it. I might also then look at things like, what reinforcement are they using? Because if the reinforcement is ineffective, it's not going to increase the chance of future behavior. Instead, it's basically just a neutral consequence or something that they were willing to accept, but that didn't act as reinforcement. Just because something is preferred doesn't mean it acts as reinforcement. Yeah? Let's talk about some different types of prompts because I feel like that'll be useful.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got things like tact prompts that I already talked about. You have physical prompts, which I've mentioned inside of this one. You have vocal prompts, right, which are using your voice. Often we would use these when you're trying to teach somebody to echo, or if they are trying to answer a question, or if even you're trying to get somebody to write and they are able to like put the word onto a page, right? A vocal prompt for writing is actually less intrusive than a vocal prompt for echoic imitation, which is copying somebody's voice,
How so?
because it doesn't give you the forms of the letters. Right.
Right. Okay.
So
Yeah.
you saying the word is relational, and you
Yeah.
writing out the correct letters is actually a slightly different skill than just hearing the word. Right.
Yeah.
But if I'm giving you the full vocal form of the word and then you're copying it, it is a full vocal prompt.
Yeah.
Right. And I could fade that to a partial vocal prompt by giving you the start of the word. Say Caroline, say cat. You get the idea.
Yeah.
Right. It's a complicated way of looking at things, but it's really how directly related to the behavior that you're trying to produce is the prompt, because that is how, you know, how salient, how obvious, how connected it is to the specific skill you're teaching, right? Other types of things might be a positional prompt. So if you were teaching somebody a receptive action, like you ask them to find the picture of the iPad, right? And you have 3 different pictures in the array in front of you, equally spaced away from the person, so that there is an equal opportunity to select any of them, equal amount of effort, and they get incorrect or you decide to errorlessly teach. By moving one of them closer to that person, that indicates that you should potentially touch that one, and then you can move it back and fade your prompt by changing position.
Yeah.
Right. So we've talked about physical. We've talked about effectively tact prompts.
And
We've
vocal.
talked vocal, and we've potentially talked about positional. I think that's probably about as deep as I'm going to go in on that one. But if you've got any other kind of like things that you would like explained, please reach out. Do you have any more questions?
No, not from me.
It's really good to be getting back to this with you, mate.
It is, yeah.
Thank you, everybody. I think that this was a good level of detail to go in to start. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you soon.